The panelists are Lijia Zhang and Sabaree Mitra, and moderating the session is Mr. C.V. Ranganathan.
No, I didn't know. See, the thing is, it's supposed to be, tribute to what we
Lijia Zhang, a writer, journalist and public speaker from Beijing, has co-authored China Remembers and a memoir, Socialism is Great, a worker's memoir on the new China. She is completing her first novel, Lotus, about prostitution set in modern-day Shenzhen. Zhang Li's first book, A Backpack and a Bit of Luck, made into the top 10 bestseller list in Borders Kuala Lumpur and was shortlisted for Travel Narrative of the Month by Borders Singapore. Her second book is an anthology called Sini Sana, Travels Around Malaysia. Professor Sabaree Mitra teaches Chinese language, literature and culture in Jawaharlal Nehru University. Her basic training has been in Chinese language and literature, and her research interest includes contemporary Chinese literature, criticism and cultural history, and India-China cultural relations. C.V. Ranganathan is former Indian ambassador to China and France, co-author of India and China, The Way Ahead, and honorary fellow of the Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi. Thank you. Over to the panelists.
You work overtime.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Obviously, people are hungry and having lunch.
Must be, yes, it's a lunch session. So.
I am very pleased to be moderator of this session. And to kick it off, we have Professor Sabaree Mitra from the Jawaharlal Nehru University. And I requested her to give a bit of a socio-political, cultural backdrop to the evolution of contemporary Chinese literature. Needless to say, China is a civilization country, one of the first countries to have a script and all the rest of it, so their tradition extends back thousands of years. But today the emphasis will be on contemporary literature. So, Sabaree, please you start and then we'll go to the other panelists.
Thank you, Ambassador Ranganathan. It is actually quite an intimidating task, if you ask me, to give a sort of chronology of things and development of Chinese literature in the 20th century, especially in terms of its socio-political and cultural backdrop. But I'll nevertheless try my best with the paucity of time. This informed audience, I'm sure, knows that China had a very rich classical literature, which was mainly kind of written by elite, consumed by elite, and the great majority of the ordinary people did not have access to it. Right in the beginning of the 20th century, we have this May 4th movement, which is called upon by the intellectuals of that time, the progressive intellectuals, who talks in terms of bringing literature to the people, and therefore requesting writers, calling upon them to write literature in the language of the people. So this is the first watershed when it comes to the beginning of modern Chinese literature in the early 20th century. Next is a kind of watershed which is slightly later, but around the beginning of the 20th century only, which talks in terms of creating literature which has revolutionary content. So from literary revolution, it becomes a cause for revolutionary literature. Literature that will be used for the cause of political capture for political power in the center, because the Communist Party of China comes into existence in 1921. So this is the second step really, where a new kind of literature is being used, which has a role to play. And in the 20s and 30s, though, there have been different perceptions between the theoreticians and the writers and the policymakers of Communist Party of China. But largely speaking, the literature, understanding of literature was largely Marxist in that period. Then next watershed, I would like to talk about the Mao Zedong's talks in Yan'an in 1942, in which he very closely links the role of literature to politics. I should say overly links to politics, where literature is expected to serve the political need of a given time. So, and this becomes the foundation of really the People's Republic of China's policy on literature and literary production, and also shows the way for the kind of literary criticism that existed through the 1950s and 60s. Meaning that when it came to evaluation of a particular literary work, there was the question of the political paradigm, and of course the question of also the literary yardstick. But very often in the 50s, through the 50s and 60s, it's the political parameter that became paramount, and therefore the kind of literary production that happened through this period was largely it was kind of a monolithic, which having not much shades of color. It was largely in terms of either revolutionary or counter-revolutionary. The characters were portrayed like that. But this was the case of the 50s to 60s, and as you all know, that 70s, end of 70s, the fall of the Gang of Four is another yet very big watershed in Chinese history, where I would like to read a little paragraph from my own writing so that it takes less time. Following the fall of Gang of Four in the 1976, new policies were introduced by the new regime that saw a shift of focus away from politics. In the late 1970s, an outward-looking leadership came into power with economic development and modernization as the most important priorities. A gamut of new policies was introduced which had profound social, political, and economic implications. In the 1980s, the economic framework was further developed, on one hand to call for greater individual autonomy, to dismantle the collective ethos, and to pave the way for socialist market economy, and on the other hand to keep pace with the opening to the outside world. Now, in literature and other domain of culture, all of these policies really found reflection. There was a re-emergence of individual in terms of portrayal of characters. There was a kind of opening to the outside world, learning from all different kinds of techniques from the West and from other cultures. And also, gradually, the literary production was getting engaged to the market forces, where the question of what is being produced and what the public was reading became important. Now, at this juncture, I would like to point out that over a period of the 1970s and 80s and even 90s, there came to exist, as a result of all these changing policies and practices, a wide diversity of Chinese literary productions which had different contexts, different concerns, and it applied all kinds of new techniques. What therefore happened was there was a complete rupture from the very monolithic kind of an existence in literary experience of the 1950s and 60s. So therefore we saw a kind of the old enlightenment tradition of the Chinese writers with a very strong moral core, which was the writers really who were very, what shall I say, very loyal to the cause of socialism and to the Communist Party of China, and yet they had their own issues. But there is another trend that started emerging, which was looking at alternative ways of depiction of characters, looking at concerns which are not completely the official perspective on a given issue. So there came about a multiplicity of discourse, and at this point in the 70s and 80s. I should say in the late 70s onwards to the 80s and 90s. Of course, there were many literary trends. There was this trend which was called the literature of the wounded, 伤痕文学 as it is called in Chinese. And in the poetry, there was the obscure poetry. It was termed obscure because the political point that it made through those poetry was not being engaged with by the official discourse. So these were looking at the political experience, the social experience of the trauma experienced by the Chinese people through the various kinds of programs and revolution, and importantly the cultural revolution. That was one of the first trend in the late 70s, early 80s. Then there was a literary trend which looked at possibilities of the universal trend in each character. So there was a whole wave of literature which was writing and portraying characters in the universal goodness of the so-called class enemy, but at the same time looking at the universal negative points even of somebody who is within the communist camp. So, and then there came another trend. There were various trends really. These are just a few examples. Then there was a very strong trend which was trying to demystify existence of women in terms of their bodily existence. This whole wave of literature was called writing the body, 身体写作, where people are most of them were women writers incidentally, but there were a few male writers also who were looking at the women's sexuality and women's identity from a perspective which was a complete taboo in the communist period, where the question of gender did not exist. The question of love was only portrayed in terms of shared political commitments. So this was another trend that came about. Similarly, there were many other trends which formed various layers in the body of Chinese literature of the 80s and the 90s, and definitely into the 21st century. What I'm basically trying to argue is that the Chinese literature, as it sort of acquired a kind of multi-dimensional identity of its own, it also responded to the readership, which then had a choice of what to read and what not to read. And therefore, the publishers, which were publishing, which was no longer just a state-controlled kind of a sector, there were private publishing happening. They were also wanting to publish those works which had a kind of an impact on people. So the literature that came to exist at the end of the 20th century and early 21st century, I would say was finding itself at the crossroads of politics, society, and the market, where the authors also had a wide range of perspectives to choose from. Secondly, I want to talk about the kind of popular culture that was developing in China at that time. It was mostly as a result of the inputs of globalization from the rest of the world, and maybe 2 decades of opening up to the rest of the world. There was a lot of academic and scholarly writings that was coming, literature being translated, literature of all kinds, creative and other kinds. And there was a kind of, I should say that the desire to the diversity that was coming from below. So far, there has been a controlled top to bottom kind of an approach, whereas there was a time where the people were really taking their own aspirations and desire, and they were trying to reflect it through formation of all kinds of popular culture that was coming about. And this was also the time when television was playing television and internet gradually playing a great role in the impact, a great influence in the production of Chinese literature. Here I want to talk about a particular writer who only represent, as I speak of him, represent really the alternative kind of a voice. I want to talk about this person, this writer called Wang Shuo. Now Wang Shuo became an icon by himself. He started writing through end of 80s and through the 90s. He was not only writing creative literature, he was also writing screenplays for television serials and sitcoms and similar kind of programs. Now, what was Wang Shuo's hallmark really was an unending kind of linguistic game, seemingly carelessly picked up from a variety of discourses, and a stamp of repartee typical of him. The main characters of his stories are private, small-time businessmen, disillusioned youth, hooligans, and petty criminals. Though Wang Shuo is satirically critical of the conventional official position, he does not propose an alternative. Very widely read, Wang Shuo was initially criticizing for producing the low culture hooligan literature. In fact, that kind of writing came to be known as hooligan literature, a trend starting from him. His language consisting of slangs, jokes, cynical parody, and a bit of obscenity that had the maximum impact on the readership. And they identify in his writing a contemporary colloquial language spoken by people of Beijing. He represented a kind of alternative culture that came along with the newly emerging social classes in the wake of economic reform. So this was one writer that I wanted to talk about. The other mention that I must make is the import of postmodernism in China. The question of the writer's subjective creativity, that there was no very strict kind of a control on literary production, as long as some basic tenets were maintained. The writers were exploring and looking at their own within, and looking from a subjective, alienated kind of an existence, and writing in a style that was completely unforeseen in previous times. In my opinion, this postmodernism, which is completely a Western kind of a theoretical perspective, did come to China and found its own expression through Chinese literature. And of course, it's debatable to see whether it acquired its own Chinese characteristics or not. Now, lastly, I just want to kind of conclude. But before that, I wanted to talk a little bit about Mo Yan. Mo Yan, the Chinese writer who was awarded the Nobel in 2012, and he is of course in a sense a mainstream writer, but when he was awarded this Nobel, I wouldn't think that he had a very large readership within China, but at the same time his writings were being translated very methodically by some Western translators and scholars of Chinese literature. For example, Howard Goldblatt from the UK. And in fact, all these translations somewhere managed to bring him into the international limelight, and he became a very serious contender for Nobel for quite a few years, till 2012 when he actually got it. I think everybody knows a lot about Mo Yan, and the person who, while giving the award to him, the citation, just give me a minute. The citations said that the Nobel Prize in Literature for 2012 is awarded to the Chinese writer Mo Yan for his hallucinatory realism that merges folk tales, history, and the contemporary. And you know, China has a very strong tradition of realism, from critical realism to the socialist realism. Now, it seems that there is a hallucinatory realism that we are talking about. But one must say that Mo Yan is extremely rich, and according to some Chinese, very non-Chinese, but I would argue that he's very much a part of this diversity and very cosmopolitan flavor of writing that's emerging in China today. And in future, I think we might have more Mo Yans to look forward to, who would be serious contenders for international attention and awards. I think I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Sabaree. I think you've traced the evolution of Chinese literature, actually progression. From rigid political correctness during the Maoist years to pushing the envelope as economic development became the main preoccupation of China, particularly after Mao's death, to how till today, and Mo Yan is a very good example. After he won the Nobel Prize, according to some reports I read, he was asked why he was so silent during the very troubled Maoist years in China. Sabaree did mention the Cultural Revolution. In fact, I'm one of those who lived in China during the Cultural Revolution. When Mo Yan was asked why he remained silent, he said, you know, remaining silent is itself the most eloquent thing to do. In other words, he did not want to be politically incorrect during his youthful years. But today, you have different challenges, and that is why I'll turn to the next speaker, where prosperity in China has also been accompanied by the most enormous social ills. Corruption is one, the regime is fully aware of it, and the new president Xi Jinping, who was in India a few days ago, has promised not to forgive the tigers and the flies. Tigers meaning top officials and flies meaning small officials, and so on. So the new emphasis is on trying to remove social ills that have also come in the wake of prosperity, inequality, lack of access to education and health, and so on and so forth. But to speak more about that, I have with me this very charming lady, in fact, three charming ladies. I think I'm very lucky today to be in such good company. We have Zhang Lijia, who is a social commentator. I think those of you who attended the session yesterday would have known about her childhood and her enormous effort to educate herself, particularly in English, and so on and so forth. She's a social commentator. I called her activist. She said, no, correct me, social commentator, which means she'll be politically correct also with regards to but she has already written a book on socialism. Is good. I'm sure it's a very satirical venture, but now in her avatar as social commentator, she is working on a book about prostitution in Shenzhen. Now Shenzhen is in the southern part of China and is the host and the origin of China's prosperity, where foreign capital was inducted and China became the industrial capital of the world and a huge exporter. So without many more words, I think I hand over the floor to Zhang Lijia, who has a very, very colorful life. as she looks, and really it's a treat to spend time with her. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Ambassador, for the very kind introduction. A small correction. My last book is called Socialism is Great. Good is not enough, obviously. I promise you it's not a dry book about socialism or politics. About my life working at a missile factory in the 80s. Socialism is Great. The title actually comes from the publisher. It's originally it's a popular revolutionary song. While I was working in the factory every year, we have to the revolutionary songs competition. One of the must sing was Socialism is Great. And I would have been happy to burst into singing for you, except it's a little harsh to the ear. So when I tell people that I published a memoir, people often look at me up and down and said, "How old are you?" And I often joke with them, "If you don't plan to marry me, why would you care how old I am?" I think it's true traditionally that you write a memoir when you reach your old age, looking back at the path you have taken. But I think the modern memoir has changed. Anybody has an interesting or compelling story to tell can write a memoir. And I hope my story is interesting or compelling enough to justify me to sitting among such a distinguished company. I grew up in Nanjing, in a residential compound which belonged to the factory my mother worked for all her life. And all my neighbors worked for the same factory, and all my friends were the children of factory workers. So become a factory worker was the most likely fate to myself. But I had a grand plan. I wanted to go to university, I wanted to become a writer and journalist, even though I didn't quite understand the difference between a journalist and writer. I had this dream because my teachers often read my writing as a good example to show other students. But when I was 16, I was taken out of school, and that was 1980, so the clever people can quickly work out how old I am precisely. The reason, of course, taking me out of school was very economical. We were very poor. Now I enjoy telling my children the story of how I would, at that time as we were growing up, food was rationed. The desirable meat was rationed. Every month we only could eat meat twice in a tiny amount. So to satisfy our craving for meat, my brother and I used to go out to catch cicadas. And the insect buzzing on the treetop. Yes. It's different from locust. I'm sure locust is probably equally nutritious. Yes, Chilean, yes, cicadas. Anyway, so I was 16, young, ambitious, and did well at school, and suddenly found myself at the factory. Today's China, if there's no democracy, but there's certainly a lot more personal freedom. But working in the 80s, working for a regimental military factory, you cannot imagine the amount of control we were subject to. The first day I entered the factory, we were given a long list of things not to do. No lipsticks, no high heel shoes, no dating within 3 years of entering the factory. Every personal aspect of your life was controlled by the party. So I decided to teach myself English in the hopes of getting a job as an interpreter working for foreign companies. Your foreign company was slowly setting up shops in Nanjing. So anyway, because at that time, teaching English was really, learning English was my escape route. The original working title of my book was called Frog in a Well. That's our story, philosopher Zhang's story about this frog being trapped in the bottom of the well that cannot see the great big sky beyond. So for 10 years, I just felt I was like a frog being trapped in the bottom of the factory well. So I decided to teach myself English. And now, of course, looking back, learning English actually changed my life. What I learned was not just ABC, but the whole cultural package. But when I started, it was not easy. Some of my colleagues started calling me as a toad who dreams to eat swan's meat. 癞蛤蟆想吃天鹅肉. You know, they laughing at me. They said, "You are a little factory worker. Why would you want to learn English?" And you know, a frog can be cute, but the toad has such a degrading connotation. Toad, something crawling on the ground. But slowly, I didn't care what other people thought of me. In fact, I became obsessed in learning English. You know, this language system is so different from our character. I would, you know, cycling in the dark street of Nanjing, sing carpenter songs, sing a song. And I heard that this, you know, singing songs, English songs, was a good way to learn the language. You probably, you know, my favorite was carpenters. You probably think of carpenters with knife. But for us, carpenters represented the high culture from the West, because carpenters was one of the first Western albums which went on sale. So anyway, slowly I become, you know, different. I dared to be different. I wear short skirts, and I had boyfriends kind of back in my, you know, my parents didn't know that. And I became political. After my English improved, I began to listen to BBC, VOA, which broadcast news very different from our propaganda. So by 1989, I organized the biggest demonstration among factory workers in support 19 Tiananmen. Yes, the movement led by students started in Tiananmen, but grew to be nationwide movement. So my book is very much a personal journey, a journey for both personal and sexual awakening. And interestingly, my journey also reflected what China went through in the 80s. And for me and many of my friends, in the 80s, it was the most fascinating era in contemporary China. That was the time that Deng Xiaoping just introduced reform, economic reform, which transformed China way beyond the economic fields. And it was a time people, you know, come to terms with what happened. It was a time Chinese people began to dream the impossibles. And it was also a time women began to put on stylish clothes. One of the Western reporters very famously said that after Deng Xiaoping started the economic reform, Chinese women suddenly got breasts. Because before that, everybody was wearing Chairman Mao's lumpy jacket. So anyway, so the 80s was a time, you know, as you very nicely summarized. It was, you know, time people began to read, experiment with new style of writing. You know, I was a factory worker. I was reading mystic poems. So in many ways, 80s was a time China became what, you know, it is today. So anyway, I think that's my story, and I should stop here.
Thank you very much, Lijia. I think it's a very inspiring story about a person, and here I'm gender neutral, who struggled during bad times in China, where the prevalence was of a rigid political ideology, who, I would say, in her own way, without getting into prison, defied the prevailing intellectual atmosphere, taught herself, even listened to foreign broadcasts, and the rest of the story we've heard from her. I must say, it is an extremely inspiring story. I, who have lived in China or known China for 50 years or more, have not heard of her more story, and I'm sure there are a lot of people like her. Now we will have a total change from the concentration on Chinese literature and its evolution, and those who write Chinese novels and other things even today, like Lijia too. This charming lady sitting next to me, see you, also Zhang. You have common ancestry, I find.
Zhang, believe it or not, is the most common.
Exactly, I was about to say that. You're Zhang, she's Zhang. So it's important to know the personal name, which is Sui, in her case Lijia. No, Sui she will describe what she is herself. Because I thought it was the most charming way to introduce oneself. But as I took the liberty of joking with her, she is footloose and fancy free. She travels all around, and I have told her, please educate us about some chosen points of your travel. And there she will also talk about India. But please begin with your self-description, which I found most charming. And I don't want to spoil the fun for our audience. Incidentally, I don't know how it is there, but we are frying under this tent.
So are we. So are we.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Ranganathan. Zhang Su Li. Okay, I have very mixed, I had and I still have very mixed emotions about this panel session, because firstly, I'm a little intimidated, but I'm also honored and excited and also very grateful that I have this opportunity to learn more about my own culture, the Chinese culture, and here I'm outnumbered. 3 Chinese, 1 Indian. So I need you to vouch for me. Okay, the introduction that Ambassador Ranganathan was talking about was that I was born Malaysian, Chinese, educated in the UK, but the strongest influence in my life is who I was in my previous life, which was, I was Indian. Not only that, but I have absolute certainty that I was a Mahari in my previous life. Now, what is interesting is that when these distinguished people talk about Chinese culture and they mention a phrase, they get a blank look from me. But when I mention an Indian term like Mahari, I get blank looks from them.
Maharani. Maharani.
Mahari. Well, in certain
Or does she
states,
mean Bahari?
Odissi, temple dancer.
Oh.
Yeah, for those that are not familiar, Maharis were temple dancers, and the dance form was Odissi. And it goes back, I don't know, some say 3,000 years, some say 4,000 years, I'm not quite sure, but the interesting history about it was that it was completely destroyed by the British in the 1940s. I'll come back to that later. But, you know, in Malaysia, there is a very strong Indian influence. And there is a state called Kedah, and it is actually Kedaram, because it's the most northern, one of the most northern states, and the Indians from, I think, well, it must have been from East India, traveled down south in the hope of going to China, I think, and then they stopped at Kedah, which they call Kedaram. Our history books, our Malaysian history books, go back as far as the 16th century, when the Indonesians actually came in, and they are now called the Malay people. But what is hidden, which I have written about in one of my stories, is something that is deliberately forgotten and taken out of, well, it never made it to the history books, was that in Kedah, there are ancient ruins built by the Joli kingdom, or the Jola kingdom, or the Pandya kingdom, and the Pandya kingdom during the 8th, 9th, and 10th century, up to 11th century. So we have ancient ruins that go back to the 8th century that nobody knows about. It's just lying there. And when you go to visit these ruins, you will find that they are not northern Indian temples, but more south. So they could have come from Tamil Nadu or Kerala, and nobody knows because no one does any research on them. However, that wasn't, the Indian culture in Malaysia isn't what shaped me as a person today. What shaped me started when I was maybe 8 or 9, where at the time when I was really interested in classical Indian dance. And every time there was a dance in town, I would go and watch it, which was maybe once every 3 years, because it wasn't popular. And I didn't know what I was watching. But after watching for 2 or 3 years, I started to feel that while Bharatanatyam is nice to look at, it's Odyssey that takes me away from the here into the world of the dancer. And that was when my love of Indian culture started. It started with Odyssey. And compared to the other writers who live lives of purpose, my travel is aimless and completely lacking in purpose. And ironically, that was what brought me to India. I took about 3 months off work to travel around India, and I got into trouble the first night. Obviously, you relate to this kind of story. I came out of Delhi airport at close to midnight with someone's address, who's a friend of a friend's mechanic's wife's brother-in-law's friend, whatever. And then I said to the cab driver, the auto driver, and I said, "This is the address." Of course, he's going to say, yes, madam, no problem. I know the place, madam. I will take care of you. You are a visitor in my country. It is my duty to take care of you. Now you sit. So I sat down and I said, "Are you sure?" "Yeah, no problem, madam, no problem." And then 5 minutes later, I'm sure all of you know that the story changes after 5 minutes. "Madam, this address that you gave me is incomplete." "What do you mean it's incomplete? You said you knew it. We've driven outside of Delhi, it's 5 minutes outside, and now you tell me that you can't take me there." I said, "No problem, madam, I take you to a hotel. I take you to a very nice, very clean hotel, my friend's hotel." So I thought, okay, I'm not going to argue with him because it's very late. So I went to this hotel that he recommended, and from there I saw some leaflets of a dancer from Delhi called, actually she lives in Noida, called Jyoti Shrivastava. And I called her the next morning and she said, "Oh, why don't you come to Noida and we will see from there." So I thought, okay, I'm homeless, so why not? So I took the bus to Noida for 45 minutes or to an hour. And while having lunch with her over 2 chapatis and a dal curry, I managed to agree to do dance with her as my guru for the next 3 months. And my love for India continued ever since, and every time I come to India, there is a different reason. I think I'll stop there. My book is actually a compilation of short travel stories of places all over the world, about 14 to 15 countries. And the main story, which is my personal favorite, is called The Dance of Life, which is about India and how I traveled around. Well, I can't say around India because I did dance for 2 months. I went to Bhubaneswar as well. Basically, the story is about the chaos in India that is perfection. And the book in general, with India as the main story, is about the fact that when we come out of our comfort zones and we go into an area that we know nothing about, that we feel so uncomfortable, that is when our long-held perceptions of what beauty, ugliness, poverty, wealth, success, and failure completely fall apart. And in India, that's where that all happens. Every opinion falls apart, time and time again. And that's what I like about my style of traveling. India proves me wrong all the time. And I love and hate India because you can't love India without hating it. I love and hate India. You can't love India without hating it. That is the depth of my love. And when tourists come to India, a lot of them say, "Oh, I hate it, I don't like it." And I say, you can't see India in 1 week. That's painful for me. Because you will only see ugliness, what our perception of ugliness is. You must go beyond that. You must scratch the surface, get to know people in order to know that poverty. Okay, I'm very aware that I will never romanticize poverty. All right, I know that there's real misery, but the kind of poverty that I'm talking about is the kind that people have only enough, maybe one chapati to share amongst 4 in the family, or 10, 2 chapatis for 10. And they will just tear them, and then they will just share. And that kind of charity and generosity is something that I have never felt in any other country. And that's the kind of poverty that I mean. Not poverty in terms of money, not poverty in terms of the spirit. Yeah, again, I have to stress, I am not romanticizing poverty, but there is a level where the spirit comes alive because of that poverty.
Malay-born, British-educated, who believes she was a temple dancer from Orissa in her previous birth. Thank you so much, Suli. That was a fantastic tour of India that you gave us. And well, thank you very much. I think what you mentioned about not romanticizing poverty is absolutely well put. In fact, looking at Indian poverty itself is a tourism attraction, I think, many times. Well, we've been told that we have to conclude this session in a few minutes. It will be a relief to get out of the heat. But before I turn the floor to the audience, I have a couple of questions. First, Lijia, please give us some flavor of the educated and aspirational youth in China, those who are well educated, who have aspiration, and the complicated demographic effects of the one-child policy. For instance, I read a rather amusing piece that it is a wonderful time to be in China today for educated, good-looking girls with a job. Why? They can lay down very stiff conditions for a boy to marry her. A car,
Flat.
a flat, etc. So,
And a height, a certain height, yes.
there you are, you see. So,
All about figures, yes.
so it's a very good time in China to be a bachelorette. Now, but jokes aside, prosperity on the one hand and the social term, which any society will have. China is not unique. So, how do young people navigate this?
Money. They want money. That summarizes it all. Many young people, they want to get rich and richer.
Well, you answered everything. You know, Chinese is a harmonic language where the same sound could have multiple meanings. So,
向前看.
向前看.
Yes, looking at.
It's
looking ahead or looking at the money?
Yeah. One translation is look forward to the future, but the other thing is only look at money. The word qian meaning both forward and money. Now, Sabaree, I don't have too many questions for you, but I do have one comment, and maybe you can. You know, in Bangalore and most of South India, unlike Delhi, which does have two very important centers of Chinese language and literature teaching. Sabaree is from the JNU, a professor there, and also Delhi University. Now tell me, here we have nothing, but tell me about how many students do you have to learn Chinese both at the undergraduate and postgraduate level, and what do they do with their Chinese after graduation? Quick.
I think I'll go back to when I started learning Chinese in 1982. We had 14 students, out of which 2 only finished the 5 years integrated program. And we found jobs. Of course, we found jobs. But now, we have an average of about 20 to 25 per batch. And all of them find jobs. And all of them find very lucrative jobs. And they own houses and cars much before we could dream of them teaching in the university. So the wide range of jobs available is of course a huge lot these days. Also freelance, starting from the tourism sector to translation interpretation. Some in the government ministries and other departments. A lot in the think tanks these days because knowing Chinese and China is very important. And lastly, some go into hardcore teaching and research like me. And people are doing very, very innovative things. And lots also go to the multinational companies.
Needless to say, you're the poorest of this whole lot.
Absolutely.
Now, the whole point is, I for one have worked for a very long time trying to explain China. And it is a disappointment to me that in Karnataka, there is absolutely no facility at the university level for the teaching and of Chinese and other things. Shuli, last question to you before we turn the floor. Now, my question is more about the interplay of Indian and Chinese cultures in Southeast Asia, and you've traveled widely in Southeast Asia. So very briefly, can you say, is there an interplay? Do people actually live in separate compartments? And how is it? I mean, what's the flavor of how Indians and Chinese get along in Southeast Asia?
Southeast Asia, I don't really see that many similarities unless you go up to Nepal, but then again, that is such a close neighbor of yours. Within Malaysia itself, of course, there is a lot of integration through food, because food is our national pastime. So we have all sorts of Indian cuisines as well. Yeah. But mostly South Indian, where we have more of the fiery red curries rather than the creamy northern, because of our weather, because it's so hot. But we also have a large percentage, not large, but it's getting larger, of Chinese-Indian interracial marriages. So they are called Chindians. Yeah. Why is that a term that is not used here? Chindians. Oh. Is it? Oh, it's very fashionable. Well, it is. Yeah.
When a politician used this word about the rise of China and India at the same time and the glorious future ahead, the term Chindia was introduced. But then, when you say Chindian,
the social,
social, which actually is more glorious than anything, I think.
So yes, we have quite a number of Chindians, but strangely enough, and interestingly enough, they become more Indian than Chinese. That I'm not sure why. So maybe one of you can shed light on this. Why is it that when Chinese and Indian culture combine? Oh, okay, all right.
Well, I don't think there's a definitive answer. I think maybe language, maybe religion, and I said maybe diet.
I find that the women are more interested in Indian culture than the men are in Chinese culture. That's why most of these biracial marriages are between Chinese women and Indian men.
Right.
About 95%.
Okay. Well, I'll now turn the floor over for whoever would like to.
You said that you said in your previous life you thought you were a Mahari. Do you believe that in reincarnation then?
That's a very difficult question to answer. I do because I want to. In the context of being a Mahari, I feel for it, and it's something that I can't explain. So in in that context, yes, I do. But in the context of reality and real life, and the duty that we have as human beings to do the right thing, then I get conflicting views on that and conflicting emotions. Karma is something that is self-regulatory, but it doesn't mean that I can just give that as an excuse, take it as an excuse and do nothing about something that I feel is unjust, or something that I really believe in, which I really fight for. I think in that context, I fight for it to a point where I fight to a point where I don't get into sorrow and sadness. So that's my personal the interpretation of karma, that we do what we can, but don't beat ourselves up over something.
Hi, I have a question to Lijia, if I pronounce it right. Lijia.
Yes, means beautiful and refined in Chinese. Obviously, my parents' impossible dream.
So, I would like to ask you a question regarding the title of your book, which is, you said socialism is great, right?
Yes, the name is a popular revolutionary song.
So, like, if you were ever given a chance to change the ideology of China, will you shift from socialism to democracy? Would you be interested?
Sorry, I actually didn't. If I could.
Yeah.
If I could.
From socialism to democracy.
Change the system.
Change the
Of
system.
course, yes, of course. That's what I'm trying to do in my small way, to, writing articles, and introducing the democratic value. And, yeah, in Beijing, I belong to an intellectual group, and we discuss in ways what can we do. I think I always use this metaphor as a birdcage. Now in China, there are people have more personal freedom than ever before. So much so, some people don't often feel the limit. But there is a cage. There's still control, selective control, and but anyway, I'm glad to see there are many people who are still trying to push back the cage, and I want to be one of them.
So socialism is great is quite sarcastic then.
And it has a quotation mark and quotation mark and exclamation mark. Yes. And once I flew to America to promote the book, and one gentleman sitting next to me was outraged on my behalf. He said, "Who gave you this stupid title? We Americans don't like socialism or communism. This title is off-putting." So ever since then, I try to get people's attention. Do see there's a quotation mark and exclamation mark.
Okay, thank you.
Very Chinese solution. That's very Chinese. More questions or shall we call it a day?
Lijia, you said that young people in China today are only interested in making money in the future. How do you reconcile that with the Communist Party? What do they think of that?
Of course, that's a sweeping, big generalization. Any generalization is dangerous. But compared to my generation, the people coming of age in the 80s, we were so idealistic. We were getting together and talk about politics, and people now don't talk about politics. Partly that's exactly what the government wants, and people there are plenty of opportunity to make money and don't think about talking about politics, don't discuss political reform. And I think there are 70 million party members, but many people see joining the party as a shortcut to success.
Well, our mind has everything, so I think should we call it a day? Is that all? Well, thank you very much.
I am trying this, and I will do it.
Thank you for the wonderful session. I request the panelists to please sign the BLF board. For further interaction with the authors and book signing, please proceed to the book signing area. And there is Inquisition, a quiz on the BLF books by Nexus Consulting from 3 to 5 p.m. at the bookstore.
They were supposed to have a reading now. That's what it says. But I don't see them anywhere. I need to stretch it. It's quite feisty. I'm not hungry yet, so I'm not very much. I was wondering if tell me about those. They're very
Maybe there's a photocopying machine here somewhere.